You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
What kind of a creature would do this? There he stood, grinning as he pulled the trigger, his pistol smoking, talking about politics, talking about Chester Arthur becoming president. The man just shot the president of the United States in a public train station in front of the Secretary of State and the president's own son, who is now admonishing the crowd in the station to clear away so his fallen father could be attended to. Who was this madman? In an act of mercy, he's saved from the crowd that wants to pull him apart. He's saved by a police officer. He tells the crowd they are mistaken. This had to be done. I had to shoot the president. Asking the police officer to contact William Tecumseh Sherman, the general, and bring the army in. It's all part of a plan, he says. Incredible enough, in this crowd is Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Lincoln. He had just been at his father's bedside 15 years before. He's now President Garfield's Secretary of War. Oddly enough, Robert Lincoln will be part of 2 more. This cursed man will see another president shot, and a New York City mayor as well. Right now, he quickly summons the doctor that he remembered treating his own father at his bedside. The babbling fool talks of stalwarts, talks of half-breed, talks of politicians like he knows them. He's aware of all the political development. And I think this is key. Charles Guiteau will now become the most hated man in America in 1881. And he's despised in history as well. I am myself, to be honest with you, producer of a podcast that is now 19 years old. There's nothing I like talking about least than Charles Guiteau, the man who shot James Garfield. I can only imagine what people at the time thought. Robbing America of a man who could have been a great president. We'll get into all the things that were going on just as this event happens. But we'll put that beside as we consider this prisoner madman using a gun for the second time since he took it out into the woods to practice. Calling for the army, one thing I note, this nobody was aware of all the little fault lines of politics. It wasn't hard because everything that we've discussed in the past 3 episodes, now in our 4th, of what will be a 5-part series on Chester Arthur. This isn't secret stuff. A few of the meetings are secret. A few of the politics aren't known. You know, we talked last week about a meeting between Roscoe Conkling and Chester Arthur. That wasn't known until many years later. But the events, yes, are being published and consumed by Americans in newspapers. They know all the details of these little fights between Conkling and Blaine. Guiteau admires Vice President Chester Arthur. Very unhelpful for his political career. He hated Secretary of State James Blaine, who's also at the train station. Doesn't shoot him, but he didn't like him. Blaine had just kicked Guiteau out of his office as he was asking for an office as if he deserved it. If Guiteau knew this stuff, so did a large amount of Americans. When you think about half-breeds and stalwarts, spoilmen, reformers, all the different fault lines and breaks in between, these branches of GOP politics are as well known in American politics in 1881 as, say, Republicans and Democrats would be now. A half-breed president was a very different thing in American minds than a stalwart one. It may not be on every issue set. For instance, we talked about how Roscoe Conkling ached over the removal of federal troops from the South and gave it to former Confederates in Congress, the Democrats, just as he did to his northern arch rivals, the half-breeds. So on some issues, they're the same. But on the issue of, say, civil service, things would be very different if people knew it. But who was this creature who turned the known partisan bravado and political machinations into violence? Word reaches Chester Arthur, now vice president. He gets a telegraph in New York City eventually that this had happened. And if he thought hard, he'd know that just the previous year he had had a man confer with him, so eager to speak for that Garfield Arthur 1880 ticket in New York. Arthur was running the stump shows. This man was almost fanatical, but to be honest, many people in New York, trying to impress, maybe looking for a job in the future, were pretty fanatical about their politics. So Arthur had put this man, Guiteau, on the stage, and why not? There's lots of speakers anyway at all these events. And he completely flops. He barely says a few words. Rise, stalwarts. He maybe lasts a minute and a half. And then, like Shakespeare's poor player, he was off the stage. And another willing speaker in his place. Arthur maybe remembered this. And of course, more recently, this same man, now that he was vice president, had approached him several times and each time acted like Arthur was his best friend. Arthur couldn't believe it. But he actually started to believe that this man thought that his minute and a half of speaking had elected James Garfield and Chester Arthur. He also pestered the Secretary of State, as we said, James Blaine. He also writes a letter to James Garfield when he's elected saying, "We were elected just as I thought," as if he had had a conversation with Garfield about it. And now, as word reaches Arthur, he's in New York. 19th century vice presidents weren't always at the nation's capital all the time, the way you might find them now, and they weren't doing missions around the world or things like that often. No, Arthur was in Albany doing some politicking, actually, when word reaches him about this terrible event. And he'll soon find out that as the man shoots Garfield, he says, "I am a stalwart, and Arthur is now president." Arthur's first inclination is not to go down to Washington, D.C., given the way that Garfield had been injured in this way. The first news reports that he gets are that Garfield's condition's pretty good. The man was a soldier after all. The secondary reports are not as good. There is no evidence that we'll talk about in this episode, no evidence that Arthur is anything else but shocked, distraught, and nervous about assuming the high office. This is not a man who feared being vice president. He wanted it. He even wanted just to be nominated, especially after what happened with the firing at the Custom House. He wanted his dignity, his image. There's no evidence that he desired the presidency. Only when Blaine sends a note that perhaps it would be good to visit, Arthur comes down. He goes to the White House. He wants to see Garfield, but Garfield's doctor, Dr. Bliss, supplied by Robert Lincoln, keeps everyone out. And it's this time that a senator observes the vice president, wrought with emotion, his face in his hands. Not every president, we said, is a Theodore Roosevelt, ready to take up the big job. When James Blaine visits him and gives him his note, and he stays at a senator's house. When James Blaine visits him and gives him news that the president's health seems to be improving, which it was, Garfield, although he'd been shot, was speaking a little, breathing, and there was some reason to have hope. If he feels better, Arthur tells Blaine, I do as well. But eventually Arthur will make the call. He gets out of the Capitol. And we find this strange today. But then with a presidential injury and really You got to think this is cross-party. This is, in American politics in 1881, this is the same as if there was somehow a Republican president and a Democratic vice president, and the Republican president gets shot, and he's not dead. How does that Democratic president handle things? The Secretary of State will handle the critical stuff, and it's getting to be summer in D.C., and as we'll discuss, a lot of the tough stuff has been resolved by now. Blaine can manage some cabinet meetings and some perfunctory stuff, talking to world leaders, etc. That's the way people perceive the Secretary of State office at this time. So Arthur goes to New York City. And while most serious opinion does not take Guiteau's words seriously about, I'm a stalwart, and I did this for Arthur, fringe opinion does. Some newspapers dream of a stalwart assassin in Guiteau that's been hired by Conkling and Arthur, who are now laughing. Says Tom Reeves, gentleman boss. A few entertain the view that Guiteau was a hired killer of Conkling and Arthur, but that view is not entertained seriously by newspapers or by the bulk of the public. But indirect blame, blaming the spoils system, blaming the fact that Conkling and Arthur fought too hard with the half-breeds, caused this whole thing. That was very common. Several leading newspapers made the point. Garfield would be alive if it wasn't for all of this fighting, if it wasn't for the race to give your side government jobs. Each time they did this, it's damaging to Arthur. As the New York Times said, Arthur had been the most narrow partisan vice president. The Times is not a friend of the stalwarts. But as we'll talk about, it's somewhat accurate. And if there had been no shooting, and if, for instance, this was an episode about Chester Arthur, a vice president, and Garfield had remained president, you could make the story exactly what the New York Times said. That Arthur, oddly enough, was the oddest, most anti-presidential vice president that there could have been. But he had his reasons. Now, it starts out well. In fact, it starts out with some form of Republican unity against the other party. Amid pageantry, a new vice president introduced. Many of the senators know him. Those that don't, he's introduced, lamb chop hair and all, by his friend Roscoe Conkling, who's the senator from New York. The vice president's main job in the 19th century is to preside over the Senate. A good one would get an ear for what the Senate's thinking and confer with the president from time to time. But really, 19th century vice presidents didn't do much more. He had to learn the parliamentary procedure, and he'd have to learn quick, because he'd be pretty quickly using that rare other power of the vice president as they preside over the Senate, breaking ties. See, in 1881, the Senate had been split, 37 Democrats and 37 Republicans, as James Garfield takes office. Then there's one independent, David Davis, an old friend of Lincoln, a judge from Illinois, but he quarreled with the GOP in Illinois, and he should be considered friendly to Democrats. Democrats' vote in that state legislature got him the senatorial job. That would make it 38-37, favoring Democrats. And Arthur's tie vote would not need to come to play. The VP only votes if there's a tie, has no vote otherwise. So everything came down to one more man, this giant man, William Mahone, who was a Virginia readjuster. This now forgotten movement, very important in 19th century Virginia politics after the Civil War, was a populist movement, repudiating the state's debt, the readjustment of the state's debt. And so the readjusters were neither Republicans nor Democrats. In fact, Republicans didn't look kindly, being the business party, on a state not paying its debt. But it was a very popular movement. And they weren't Democrat. They ran against the Democrats. So someone had to make a deal. And the Republicans said, essentially, look, Mahone, we'll give you the sergeant of arms job to your friend, and the Senate secretary to your friend, and gulp. We'll give you all of the Virginia patronage too. And gulp. He has one more demand. There'll be no Republican candidate in the next couple of Virginia elections. We'll let the readjusters have the ballot against the Democrats alone. That's a tough one for the party to take. And the readjusters will get another senator to join Mahone in 82. It's almost assured by this change. That's a deal. And a tough one, but the trade brings us to 38 Democrats caucusing and 38 caucusing with the Republicans. And now, 3 times, Arthur breaks 3 votes to get the Senate organized, with Republicans heading all the right committees and also dodging a Democratic blocking maneuver. This makes Chester Arthur in the history books about 25th. It's a tie at 25th for the number of tie votes used during a vice presidency. Quarrel with the Democrats over, because on all those votes where Chester Arthur was breaking the tie, the half-breeds and the stalwarts and any other independents were all voting together. But now it's time for Republicans to start fighting amongst themselves. Okay, so as we discussed in the last election, you have James Garfield elected. And given the convention where he wowed the convention, he's not directly a half-breed. But stalwarts worry and do think that he largely is, that he's mostly a puppet of James Blaine. Half-breeds wish he was. See, that's the thing. From their point of view, we hope the guy's a puppet. But as Thomas Reeves says in his book, they fear he's a weather vane. He just follows the last person he talked to in his office. So Blaine makes sure that he's always the last person to talk to him. And in fact, there's more contact between the 2 old friends, Blaine and Garfield, than there ever would be between, say, Garfield and Conkling. But Garfield wants to reach out to the stalwarts more than Blaine wants him to. There's 2 arguments here. One is at the convention, it was mostly Blaine votes, mostly Blaine delegates to the convention that nominated Garfield. The stalwarts were against him. They wanted Grant. But in the general election, Conkling was out there speaking, Arthur was stumping, and General Grant was stumping. The stalwarts got you New York and got you that election, helped you in the general election to beat the Democrats in a very narrow race, need we remind. At a dinner, and Arthur will actually take a few lumps for this, at a dinner at Delmonico's with all of these fat cats. This is the kind of circles that Arthur would be very comfortable in, with the fine dinner in front of them. Arthur makes a joke about buying votes in Indiana. Now, it's well known in the 19th century that things like this go on. Arthur makes an indelicate joke about it, and it gets reported in New York newspapers. Doesn't make Arthur look so good. A few people think maybe it's not a joke at all. Maybe it's a way of reminding Garfield that Arthur and Conkling helped in his election. If you're like me, I can't think when things aren't clean and tidy around me. That's why HomeAglow is great. HomeAglow is a top-rated home service platform. It has online booking capabilities that allow you to instantly schedule a cleaner who works in your area for a special occasion, for a party, or how about this? To just come in on a regular basis and clean things up. All cleaners pass a rigorous certification process and maintain a 4.8 star average platform rating. Now, HomeAglow is sponsoring this episode of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, and we thank them. To schedule a cleaning, you go to HomeAglow's website, you choose the day and time you're looking for and the duration of your cleaning, and you match with a cleaner. You can schedule it as quickly as this week, or you can get something on the calendar for next month or check it off your to-do list early. The best part is their Forever Clean membership, which saves you $30 an hour on all future cleanings. You can book unlimited cleaning starting at $19 per hour, backed by Home Aglow's Happiness Guarantee. Now, take home cleaning off your plate this summer by using Home Aglow. Head to homeaglow.com/myhist, MYHIST, myhist, to get your first 3 hours of cleaning for only $19. That's HOMEAGLOW.com/myhist. Garfield doesn't want to be seen as a puppet. And I think in the reflections on history that you have about Garfield, he's not. And you kind of see what he's trying to do. He knows that mostly the half-breeds are supporting him, but he can't ignore the stalwarts either. He'll pick people who are stalwarts, but it wasn't Roscoe's, Conkling's choice. He might go to them directly, which Conkling notices, picks up on all these things. He'll offer the stalwarts in New York, foreign positions. How about Russia? How about Lithuania? Conkling, his point, I don't want Lithuania. I want somebody in New York City. I want federal jobs there in New York, where it can be effective to my political machine. It's not the greatest offense. The greatest offense is when Chester Arthur, as vice president, is reviewing nominations coming to the Senate and then sees William Robertson, an opponent, a bitter opponent of Conkling, to be nominated for the Custom House, the job that Arthur used to have in New York. It's war. On this, it's war. In Garfield's view, President Garfield says, look, I gave New York 2 cabinet positions, the Attorney General and the Postmaster. I'm going to put in for several. I'm giving Conkling his choices on several district attorney jobs. But this is the job that really, really means a lot. This is where all the money comes from. Garfield even considers, maybe we can offer Conkling a position in the cabinet. And Blaine flips out. Blaine is like, are you kidding? It will be like strychnine, immediately ending your presidency. But then Garfield wonders if maybe Blaine's just getting, hyperventilating over all this stuff. The truth is, Conkling would never accept a position in the cabinet if Blaine was sitting there at the table. Conkling wasn't a play politician. He was a real politician. Generally, you were getting his real opinion on things. He wasn't going to sit there and play with Blaine as part of a team when he hated him. In any way, Conkling wanted the power. He wanted to build up his machine in New York, and a cabinet position wasn't important. The New York Herald, which was supportive of Conkling and Arthur, said, every wish of Senator Conkling has been denied, and a sharp politician has been put as the head of the Custom House who will make it work against Conkling. The St. Louis Democrat said, James Garfield is looking like a willing instrument for James Blaine's vengeance. The interesting thing is, if you remember back to episode 2, Stalwarts, we talked about how Arthur and Conkling have been here before, but with President Hayes, when Arthur himself was fired or suspended from his Custom House jobs, and Theodore Roosevelt Sr. was put in his place. And Conkling fought that in the Senate. He was at least able to block Hayes, initially at least, from replacing Arthur. And he won that fight for a bit. He thinks he can do it again. So he goes to the Senate. And he's going to make that argument that the New York Herald made, that for appointments of the same party in a state like New York, you should be consulting the New York senator. He's going to go to the Senate and say this. First, a letter of protest is sent to President Garfield. He more or less ignores it. It's sent from merchants who use the Custom House, saying that they'd rather keep the customs collector that they have. Now, you and I both know that in any industry, Businesses don't necessarily like their regulator, their taxer. So if they're doing something like that, they've probably been cajoled into it. And indeed they had. And indeed the person who organizes the letter, who knows those merchants, having worked at the Custom House, is Vice President Chester Arthur. So you see here that a vice president is already organizing, in a sense, against his own administration. Garfield knows that he has a fight. He writes in his diary, "This will once and for all settle the question as to if the president is the president, or is he the receiving clerk of the Senate." Half-breeds are building him up. A Whitelaw Reid editorial comes out, and people really respect reading Whitelaw Reid over at the Tribune. He's replaced Horace Greeley. People like his writing, especially among Reform Republicans. Reid makes it clear they cannot withdraw the nomination no matter how much pressure they get. Robertson needs to be appointed. If he withdraws, Conkling is in effect president. Garfield is a laughingstock. Boldness and tenacity is needed here, and Garfield only need hold the course. John Hay, secretary under Abraham Lincoln, comes to visit the White House, visits Garfield. He's a good friend of Plain. And he presents this editorial to him. And Hayes notes that Hay observes that Garfield is just delighted by reading this editorial. And he assures Hay, I'm not withdrawing this nomination. Stalwarts then protest in the Senate. Certain newspapers contain protest notices. This is organized by Arthur, and people see it. The Chicago Evening Journal finds Arthur's role in the organizing of the anti-Robertson effort reprehensible and disgusting in the second officer of government. The great Republican Party didn't elevate him to play boss on the back of Lord Roscoe. But in Chester Arthur's view, it's simply this. If it's not Conkling that's pulling the strings on this Custom House assignment, then Blaine will be. It's one boss or the other. If it's not them collecting the assessments to be sure that New York State will turn GOP, Blaine's men will. And half-breeds and reformers, they're not as good at this. And the state could be lost to Democrats. It's a very split state. But what's not as well known in all the talk about Arthur's politicking is that Arthur does do a very vice presidential, a very team player thing. He quietly goes at night, dodging reporters, and goes to see James Garfield at the White House and asks him quietly to remove the appointment. It will badly fracture New York, he says. And once we're fractured, Democrats have a good chance of winning there. Don't you want this state to be carried by you, perhaps in 1884? Garfield refuses. He sees this appointment as essential and notes that he's made other New York appointments, enough New York appointments that should be satisfactory. We now go back to the Senate and remember what we had just discussed earlier, that the Senate is deadlocked in 1881, and Conkling reminds President Garfield with his actions that the Senate is narrowly deadlocked. Conkling insists that the Senate keep delaying, keep incumbents in office. He works the GOP caucus, the group of senators that will meet before they go on the floor. He gives them a preview. He tells the rest of the senators, before we go out there on the floor, I'm letting you know, I'll fight everything this president does. I'll fight every appointment. I'll make sure he doesn't appoint anyone. He has friendly newspapers, the New York Herald, who mirror this message. Conkling also tells the senators, I have a letter. I don't want to use it, but I have a letter. And when I do use it, he, Garfield, shall bite the dust. Members of this GOP caucus are scared. There's one senator, particularly Senator Dawes of Massachusetts, looks at this and says, Conkling is Conkling, but he's got more fight than even usual here. They basically approach the White House and say to James Garfield, before we have to go on the Senate floor here and fight this, just so you know, he really means it this time. He's not just barking. And Garfield, his fight up now, maybe buoyed by that Whitelaw Reid editorial, merely records in his diary that it appears the GOP caucus had been conned by Conkling. He doesn't back down. Conkling doesn't back down either. Conkling gets the caucus to go forward with regular nominations and table the unpleasant nominations, which some senators object to for later. But this wasn't enough. The stalwarts go ahead and publish that letter. Garfield knows the letter. It's a letter of James Garfield himself asking about assessments, looking as grubby as Chester Arthur or any of them, asking how the fundraising was going, the assessment of federal employees. He was mid-campaign, and he wanted to win. It was very common for people to ask about these things. One of the people is Jay Hubble. But the problem is, Jay Hubble is now a person who's embroiled in a scandal involving the selling of postal routes, and we'll get in that probably in the next episode. But he's a scandalous person, not the person James Garfield wants to be associated with. They publish the letter, and Garfield is angered. He withdraws all of those New York appointments that he made. And of course he leaves in William Robertson. Now he'll give nothing to the stalwarts. I mean, they have the postmaster and the other things, but he tells his diary, I may lose this fight, but I won't be finessed out of the fight. I won't withdraw. I won't delay. Robertson gets a vote up or down, essentially. It's an act of warfare, the New York Times says. Who is president? The Baltimore American asks. At last, we have our answer. James Garfield is president. And this is a real question. In the 19th century, it's not as obvious as things are now, where the president's a very powerful office. It was a coveted office, to be sure. And it had some power. It always did. But in the 19th century, the real question of how much it did, how much it was driving the agenda, especially versus senators. So we have evidence here that Vice President Arthur now goes on the record with a reporter, the editor of the New York Herald, and talks badly about his own president. Garfield, he said, is spurred on by Blaine. He's easily led, and he has broke every pledge that he has made to us New Yorkers. He means the New York stalwarts. And he's done it in the most offensive way. Arthur's a very gentle and polite person. The Herald, in its discretion, does not publish Arthur's comments. Publishes the disappointment, finds other people who mention the disappointment from New York with Garfield. But it's too delicate to have a vice president attacking a president. But we know these comments are made. The Herald also does this. It asserts that Garfield in the campaign promised the New Yorkers New York patronage, control over New York patronage, and is now going back on its word. But it doesn't produce any letter of that or any document of that. It just says it. So you have the fight, and Conkling and Arthur on one side, Garfield on the other. There's a feeling among the GOP that Conkling should have Senate privileges, but how long can we resist this for? Because this is larger. We shouldn't take nominations away from the president. Shouldn't cut this president off at the knees so early. You're seeing here in 1881 with James Garfield a very short presidency, but the presidency being fought out, another battle of many battles in American history about executive strength and the relationship between the president and the Senate. And a key thing happens. Democrats who had been sort of like we'd say today, eating popcorn, watching the half-breed and stalwart Republicans fight each other. After all these appointments have been delayed and we're not appointing, say, postmasters and various marshals and attorneys and things like this, unconstitutional principles start to approach some Republicans. And the president should be able to appoint who he wants. That's the way it works. I mean, just out of the good of the country here, it's better than delaying. And the Senator Voorhees from Indiana actually goes and visits Garfield and pretty much tells him that I'm going to be a vote for that. Why should Democrats sustain Roscoe Conkling's tirade? We don't work for him. We don't even like him. He attacks us all the time. And so it becomes pretty clear that Robertson's going to get through the Senate. And this is where Thomas Platt, the other senator from New York, the one that got in a little bit of a deal with the runaway stalwarts like Governor Cornell of New York and working with some of the half-breeds. Okay, I'm not going to interfere with Garfield's patronage involving New York. He has an idea. And it's an idea that Chester Arthur thinks is foolish, tries to talk him out of it. But it comes out of Platt's dilemma. And Platt's dilemma is, the reason he got senator is because he had got a little annoyed by Conkling. It wasn't totally burning the bridges, but a little annoyed, and went to Cornell and the others and got a Senate seat. And that's good. But he agreed to vote for all patronage that would come from the White House. He didn't think they were going to use, this is the 19th century, and I can't use this metaphor, but the atomic bomb, the custom house, the biggest federal office, the most money coming into the federal government. He didn't think that was going to be who they're going to choose. He didn't get this Senate seat to slap his friend, his mentor, his boss, Roscoe Conkling, in the face. But he also gave his word to support the patronage. So right now, he's inclined to resign his Senate seat. And if he resigns, the state this is how you do it in the 19th century, the state legislature in Albany will now pick a replacement. He'll run again. He wants a re-up. He wants to be reaffirmed by the New York State legislature, this time without any promises. So then he'll be free to vote down Robinson. But he takes it a step further. I shouldn't do this alone. Roscoe, Senator Conkling, you should do this too. Arthur hated the idea. He said the votes may not be up there in Albany. It's not quite locked up like that. Conkling jumps on it. This is a chance to redeem himself and embarrass the administration. And so there's a day in the Senate when Arthur, as the presiding officer, hands the clerk a letter. The clerk reads it, and it is Conkling's letter of resignation, followed by Platt's. The Senate is shocked. Shocked. In his letter of resignation, Conkling, who all his political life has supported the spoil system, now attacks Garfield for being a spoilsman, saying that he's replacing a perfectly good custom house officer without cause. The New York Times calls it childish. Thurlow Weed, kind of the creator of the Republican Party in New York, who had been a supporter of Conkling, says it's a weak attempt at the heroic. Says it was a stupid move and would insult the state legislature. Garfield himself writes in his diary, it's a weak attempt at the heroic. Blaine loves dueling with Conkling. Since they were in Congress in the 1860s, he loves nothing more than this. Oh, what an idiot, Blaine's thinking. This guy just took himself off the pedestal he was on. And now he gets a hotel room in Albany, and he's going to start working members of the legislature to vote against Conkling. And he gets one of his friends, Chauncey Depew, a railroad lawyer, and gets him to run as the half-breed candidate. And now the battle between the stalwarts and the half-breeds, and really has become the battle between Conkling and Garfield, moves from Washington, D.C. up to Albany. And eventually Arthur and Conkling will get there too. There's some thought that Conkling is a little late on arrival. And so one of the things Blaine and his allies are able to do right off the bat is delay the vote. So this thing, it could have happened 2 weeks after his resignation. They're able to get a delay. And stalwarts weren't quick on that. Here's from Thomas C. Reeves. Albany quickly filled with politicians, newsmen, and spectators eagerly anticipating the head-on collision between the New York stalwarts and the Garfield administration forces in the state. Conkling and Arthur arrived together on the afternoon of May 24th, 1881. A band of loyalists at the railway station gave 3 cheers for the former senator. Both men lifted their hats obligingly and walked over to the Delavan House. Instead of ignoring the clerk at the desk, as was Roscoe Conkling's custom for the hotel that he would visit quite often in the state capital, Conkling signs the hotel register in bold letters. A little bit of John Hancock here. and stood grinning as a crowd cheered for Conkling, Platt, Grant, and the brave stalwarts, which were now going by the name 306, the brave 306, reflecting the votes that they maintained for General Ulysses S. Grant at the convention. As he made his way up the stairs into his room, he shook hands with everyone in reach. Nothing could have been more gracious than his manner, said an awed reporter, and no statesman ever wore a more winning smile. Conkling was prepared for the supreme fight of his political life. And Reeves sums up the situation pretty well here. There's 106 Republicans in the state legislature. 72 of them had to agree to call a caucus. The reason, Conkling wants a caucus because if he gets that, he just has to win a majority of that to win out in the legislature. Stalwarts expressed confidence in their ability to get enough signatures for the caucus. But opposition to the effort was immediate. Immediately, 40 lawmakers from the legislature go on record as being against a caucus. During this time, Vice President Arthur is trying to get members of the legislature to sign a petition for a caucus. Now, part of the problem is that, and we didn't get into it because it's a little bit of an obscure matter, but in Washington during the debate over Robertson's appointment, Roscoe Conkling was encouraged to enter a Republican caucus about that, and realizing he would lose that vote, he refused to attend the caucus. So the New York Times is bringing up the hypocrisy here. A rebel against a caucus in Washington ought surely to have some tolerance for those who refuse to bow to the tyranny of the caucus at Albany. They now try to get a convention, a lighter form of a caucus that won't be binding. Very few takers. People are noticing that Vice President Arthur is leading the Conkling team here, he's essentially against his own administration. The New York Tribune declares, if General Arthur does not desire for 4 years of public contempt, he would do well to desist from the business in which he is now engaged before his inexcusable indiscretion becomes a national scandal. E.L. Godkin over at The Nation says, Mr. Arthur, the vice president, is exciting a great deal of indignation, not only in this state but all over the country, by his performances at Albany as a touter of votes for his friend. There's a cartoon that shows Arthur, the vice president, shining the shoes of Conkling, doing his bidding. And then their old friend Alonzo Cornell, the governor of New York, who the stalwarts were responsible for electing, is very limited in his support for Conkling. Here's what Reeves says. The governor consulted with stalwart leaders during their stay in Albany, but made no public statement and did not permit the state machinery to enter this contest. This is exactly what Arthur was afraid of. The New York Herald, which is the newspaper of Arthur and Conkling, reported that the senator was angry with the governor for failing to come to his aid. Now, on the first ballot, 20 men are nominated. Cornell, the governor, is nominated. The former governor, Folger, the former senator as well, Crowley, Dutcher, Morton, all of these people are nominated. Levi Morton, it should be said, when we were talking about the 1880 convention, he's one of those 306. And he was a potential person for the vice presidential slot. Is probably who Garfield and the others wanted more than Arthur in that vice presidential spot. Levi Morton now sees his opportunity and allows his name to be put in to run for this Senate seat that Conkling has vacated. In fact, Conkling on the first ballot receives just 39 votes. When Garfield hears about it, the president sneers in his diary, "Is this the vindication he appealed for?" Platt gets even less. Platt gets only 29 votes. And neither men. In all of the votes that are going to come, and there's going to be over 30 of them, in that 19th century fashion. This is one of the reasons we have a 17th Amendment, by the way. We don't elect senators by state legislature. It ties up the state legislature with these constant votes. Conkling and Platt might have chosen to bow out of the race at this point because their candidacies were ended. It was obvious. But as in 1880, when the 306 stuck together to the bitter end, Conkling and Platt were determined to fight to the last. The balloting continues, Thomas Reeves writes, 6 days a week for more than 7 weeks. For a short time, the Conklingites held the largest single block of Republican votes, but other candidates from within the administration faction soon gained ground. By the 7th roll call, Chauncey Depew forged ahead of Platt. 2 ballots later, a stalwart claimed he had been bribed to vote for Depew by a leading half-breed. The charge seemed contrived from the start. A legislative investigation dismissed it. On the 16th ballot, out of nowhere, former Vice President William Wheeler moved in front of Conkling. He had been vice president under Hayes, and he would be much more aligned with the reform group than Conkling. At one point, after 22 ballots, Democrats, who again are kind of watching this with popcorn, they have their own candidate. They're not participating with any of the Republican Senate choices. They challenge the stalwarts to a game of baseball. They don't play that game. And then something happens, and it involves a stepladder. Thomas Platt, it appears, was having some affairs in Albany at a nearby hotel. Let's just state it that way. And some crafty half-breeds brought over a stepladder. And let's see how Thomas Reeves describes it. They had peered through an open transom into a hotel room, spying him in bed with a woman, decidedly not his wife. Okay, so what's a transom? And you have to think about like maybe a vintage hotel or an old wooden like door. And you might see above it a glass window, a very thin horizontal glass window that's almost, the length of the wall. And it's over the height of most people, so there's still some discretion. But if you get a stepladder, you can peek in. And that's exactly what these people do. And although there's no kind of camera, I don't believe the Kodiak is invented yet. I think that's going to come later. The Kodak, I should say, where you can snap pictures like that. They're not taking any pictures or doing anything like that. But enough people have seen it that there's a credible newspaper stories when they go to the newspapers with it. And so after that appears in newspapers in Albany, Platt simply leaves the race. And now Conkling is alone. And Arthur is still with Conkling. And that's when, July 2nd, the newspapers had just announced Platt's withdrawal. The whole Conkling scheme is crashing down. And when President Garfield enters this station to escape that summer D.C. heat and to see his wife, who is sick, up in Long Branch, New Jersey, he's a political winner, and everybody knows it, and the whole cabinet's greeting him to see him off. Politics look really good, and the potential really good for President James Garfield's presidency. And then the shooting. Here's how Reeves describes that shooting. A small, shabbily dressed man with a dark brown beard and sallow complexion suddenly appeared behind the two men, drew a revolver, pointed it at the president's back, and fired. He ran a few steps closer and fired. Again, Garfield fell to the floor. The assailant said nothing, and he fled towards an exit. So it's possible Gatto might have escaped. I don't know how far he would have gotten in D.C., but Officer Patrick Kearney of the District of Columbia Police hears the shots, runs into the reception room in time to seize him. "I must arrest you," he says. "All right," came the reply. "I did it, and I will go to jail for it. I am a stalwart, and Arthur will be president." So now we know what's going on where Arthur is when the president's being shot, because Conkling will not give up his Senate attempt, even though it seems like it's in the cards. And Arthur's with him. It's only when the legislature breaks and they go to New York City, they get that news. Arthur issues a statement, "I am profoundly shocked. The hopes you express," and he's referring to Blaine, saying maybe, there's some good news, "relieve somewhat the horror of the announcement. I am overwhelmed with grief," Arthur tells a reporter. He won't speak to many. Blaine tells him to take the midnight train to D.C. He does. Conkling greets him at the station. The one report has that Conkling carries his bags, maybe thinking he's now carrying the bags of the new president already. Benjamin Harrison sees him down in D.C. and is the future president is one who says he seems, Arthur, to be overcome with grief. One reporter says, tears filled his eyes. No one deplores the tragedy more than Senator Conkling and myself. I am an American among millions of Americans grieving for our wounded chief. That's Arthur's statement. So Arthur ends up staying in D.C. He's never allowed to see the president himself. He does see Garfield's wife. He does meet with Blaine several times. He stays 10 days and then goes back to New York. Something happens that might be a little peek into the future. Again, we don't see too much of Arthur rebelling against Conkling, if we can call it that, but something small happens because there's a meeting now. They finally have a caucus meeting, given these tragic events, of the GOP up in Albany about what we're going to do here. And the writing's on the wall. It appears like it's going to be more like, how do we elect a non-Conkling senator here? And in this case, Arthur, now perhaps the president in waiting, doesn't go up to Albany. And then Conkling refuses to go to the meeting. One of his tactics sometimes. And when he doesn't, Arthur's asked about it and actually says to a reporter, I think my friends are mistaken in this. July 22nd, 1881, Elbridge Lapham was elected with 50, after the New York legislature had voted in 56 ballots. Arthur spends the rest of July and August in seclusion in his home in Lexington Avenue. In August, he does meet with Ulysses S. Grant and Conkling. They learn Garfield is infected. So there's all of these hopes during the summer of positive news, and they bring Garfield to Long Branch, New Jersey, his seashore home where he was going to visit his wife anyway, and they feel like maybe he's improved, but in early September, it's revealed that one of his glands is infected, and this isn't the 20th century even where you can, prescribe antibiotics or something. This is a killer, and he's feverish, and he's not making sense. There's even debate in the cabinet. Maybe we should have Arthur come here. Arthur says, no, he'll remain in New York. It won't be long. Here's Reeves again. In late August, Arthur received a letter from someone who identified herself merely as Julia Sand. It began, the hours of Garfield's life are numbered. Before this meets your eye, you may be president. The people are bowed in grief. But do you realize it? They're bowed in grief not so much because he is dying, but because you are his successor. We know that Arthur reads this letter by this random person in New York City, Julia Sand, who sounds like a very young woman, but seems to know the politics and things like that. But there's no way that Arthur couldn't have agreed with the way she was surmising things. He reads on, what president ever entered office under circumstances so sad? The day he was shot, the thought rose in 1,000 minds that you, Arthur, might be the instigator of the foul act. Is not that a humiliation which cuts deeper than any bullet can pierce? Your best friend said, Arthur must resign. He cannot accept office with such a suspicion resting on him. And now your kindest opponents say, Arthur will try to do right, adding gloomily. He won't succeed, though making a man president cannot change him. Now, there's no way that Arthur agreed. In fact, we know later that Arthur will contest this type of thing. It's obvious. This isn't the way Arthur sees the politics. But he does see that some people see it this way. But Julia Sand's changed her tune. Great emergency, she says, awakens generous traits which have lain dormant half a life. If there's a spark of true nobility in you, now is the occasion to let it shine. I beg you not to resign. Do what's more difficult and brave. Reform. Rise to the emergency. Disappoint our fears, Julia Sand says. She's going to write many letters in the next couple of years. And at one point, Arthur will come to see her. We'll talk about that in the next episode. He'll never write a response to the letters. But we know he's been reading from that conversation they'll have later. That doesn't mean he agrees. Now, I think too much has been made of Julia Sand. I also believe that Arthur's been getting all sorts of letters, I believe. And I think that it's gone as far as to say, well, Julia Sand changed his mind. He was going to be a stalwart, and he changed to a reformer because of Julia Sand. No, I think Julia Sand just sums up the obvious political situation. That perhaps what Arthur's about to inherit here is not his own presidency, but a half-breed presidency, and he has to make adjustments, good politician that he is. Many people had encouraged Arthur to resign. He won't resign. Another thing he doesn't do is appoint a pro temp of the Senate, because there was a fear, the way that everything was so split there, that could have ended up being a Democrat, and we'd have a Democrat president. Even the Republicans don't want that. They'd rather have Arthur. So even though it seemed to some to be a little, he's going to get some criticism in the press for not having worked on a pro temp. I mean, he didn't know that Garfield was going to get shot, but having not put that contingency in there, and he'll get some criticism for that. So, Arthur actually must succeed Garfield. Julia Sand was right. Garfield's days were numbered. He was brought to Elberon, as we discussed, New Jersey. Shout out to listener Joe DeWack. I understand you're near the old Garfield house at this time. I think that's a great thing to experience for history, to see a place like that. It wasn't getting better. People knew it. There's evidence now. Candace Millard's excellent book, Destiny of the Republic, gets into how badly, even by 19th centuries, Dr. Bliss served the president, poking, probing, getting his dirty, infected hands into the president, never finding the bullet. They even use some contraptions. They try all kinds of things. An early air conditioner is used. Nothing helps. Old-fashioned medicine might have killed him just as much as that bullet. By September 19th, the cabinet essentially tells Arthur, please get ready. And the messenger comes. At 11:30 at night, September 19th, Arthur's son, Alan, a freshman at Columbia, shows up to support his father. Elihu Root, he'll have a future, and Steve French, these GOP stalwarts friendly with Arthur, will arrive to support. Judge Charles Duchesne will administer the oath, and Arthur is now the 21st president. Men may die, he issues a statement, but the fabrics of our institution remain unshaken. All the noble aspirations of my lamented predecessor, which found expression in his life, will be garnered in the hearts of the people. It will be my earnest endeavor to see that the government functions by his example, is a statement that Arthur issues, perhaps hopefully to reassure some folks. He does one more thing as his first act as president before he gets on that train. He writes a letter to himself at the White House to call the Senate into session to elect a senator pro tem who can then be president. This is in case anything happens to him. If there's another Guteau in the waiting at one of the train stations, he mails it to himself. He won't need it, but just in case. I want to thank you for listening to episode 4. There will be an episode 5. We're going to talk about what no one ever talks about, very little, the Chester Arthur presidency. And we'll talk a bit about that civil rights bill. That's probably his most notable achievement, if you will, and how maybe the story around it's a little different than what people think. I want to thank you for listening. If you're supporting the Patreon, I appreciate it. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com is the website.
Every minute your finance team spends wrestling with data is a minute lost. Insight Software's AI-powered insights instantly move you from complexity to clarity. Automated analysis, real-time reporting, strategic recommendations, all at your fingertips. Transform how your finance team works and watch your business grow. Stop wasting time. Start making smarter decisions. Learn more at insightsoftware.com/AI.